I'm delighted to be here. It's been a very interesting afternoon. I've been listening to all the people speaking before me, and I think that we can all agree that we've learned a lot of the different aspects of resilient leadership, hybrid work, and what to focus on. A lot of to-do lists, I think. If I was a leader of an organization, I would have been listening to this as this is my to-do list for the coming years. I'm talking today from the position of a research director of Future of Work program. So my talk is based on a lot of research hours. I work, for instance, together with Juha, and a lot of the stuff that we research together, and also a lot of research from colleagues, both here in Aalto and globally. But I think that the one thing to sort of bring out first is that what you've already heard a lot about is that when we talk about future of work, it's important to define what we mean by that. What we mean by that is technology-driven change in terms of how we work, how we lead, what's going on in organizations. And that's something that we have been doing research on now for 4 years, studying longitudinally, interviewing top managers amongst the 50 biggest companies here in Finland, many of them multinationals, and asking these top leaders, okay, so what's changing in terms of how is technology changing the way you work, how you manage people, how you organize your processes. And I'm going to start with COVID, even though Gitte, for instance, said that we're going to leave it for now, because I think that all big transformation processes, there's something about them is that we're going to know the implications only later on. And Corona has been a great catalyst of change in many ways. And here I offer my apologies to anyone who's experienced terrible things during it. It's not a positive thing as it is, but it is a great opportunity to look at our organizations, look at accelerated change, look at accelerated discomfort, and think, what do we learn from this? And I'm actually going to offer you a few excerpts from a research interview that I've done in the beginning of this summer, kicking off our 3rd round of interviews. And there, a leader talks about how he has been leading through Corona. But I think that we should really start by asking this question. And if you are here now in front of me, I would maybe force someone to answer the question that, how are you guys doing? What's going on? Now you're not, and I'm not going to make Markus answer, but maybe I will when he comes to talk to me after the talk. But I am actually wanting you to park this question in the back of your head, and I want you to think about that. Have you asked that from your family? Have you asked that from yourself? Have you asked that from your team? Have you asked that from your immediate surroundings at work, etc.? Because we all are still under the influence of Corona, even if we like to think that it's almost done and the vaccinations are going around. And when I'm looking at, I have colleagues who have been doing this COVID research, started immediately when COVID started. And in their data, one of the biggest things coming up is this need for leadership one-on-one, this question. And one very important point about this question is that it's not enough to ask this question, you really need to listen. And then you need to also disconnect this question from anything work-related. You need to just ask, how are you doing? So park this question in the back of your head. We have some research evidence that it's one of the #1 leadership questions right now. Why is that? Well, the reason is you might know that there's also a lot of global psychology studies, neurological studies on the go on the effects of Corona, on our brain, on our mood, on our resilience. And one of the things that researchers have come up with, that what we're all still, not all, but to varying degrees, suffering from is resilience. Our resilience levels are not as high as they would otherwise be. Whether you feel it or not, Corona has impacted your resilience because it has made us face the fact that life is something we cannot control. On top of that, psychologists and neurologists are now reporting that there are a few studies on the go in Europe already. In the studies, what people are reporting is brain fog. By that, they mean cognition problems, difficulties in thinking, being creative, being innovative, and just feeling tired and not sort of able to, kind of foggy brain. And the #1 thing to focus on here from the leadership perspective is what the neurologists say, that this is all due to the lack of social contact. Our brains wake up in the presence of other people. I'm already feeling a bit exhilarated by the fact that I've met a handful of colleagues who are here, and I haven't actually met that many colleagues over the last 1.5 years either. But this is a scientific fact, and this is the explanation for the brain fog, and there are many ways you can tackle this. And what the researchers, what neurologists, for instance, were saying, that it's not something at the moment, they don't think it's something that's going to stay with us. And you can actually remedy this by just going out and doing as much as you can, changing scenery, trying to meet people outside and changing faces. And in this article that I read about this one researcher said that even if you're in a lockdown in a one-room apartment, you can try to trick your brain by changing pictures on the wall. And that's going to feel like change and probably help you with the brain fog. But from the leadership position, this is seriously a very important thing to take into consideration when you're thinking about resilience in organizations. Understanding that one thing we know about Corona is that it treats people very unevenly, from tragedies to then some people reporting better ability to focus on maintain their work-life balance. And it does have an impact on all of our resilience level and all of our brain capacity. We have heard today a lot, like I said, a lot of tips in terms of what to focus on in building new types of working cultures, in building your own resilience, in enduring stress as a leader, in thinking about how you're kind of keeping the holy grail of performance versus well-being in balance. And I think that we've also heard the main parts of what does it mean when we're talking about future work. What does the sort of growingly complex context of VUCA world mean? Another important thing to bring up regarding that context setting, because as you know, you always need to know your context to be able to do anything, is that this is not a new thing. And therefore, it's important to understand that when we're looking at changing nature of work, when we're looking at what we all call the future of work, or we can also call it the fourth industrial revolution, we're not looking at something that's like unprecedented and new in terms of a change process. We can look back and we can see that between the second and the third industrial revolution, there were exactly the same kinds of concerns what we have now. So we could actually avoid a lot of the doom and gloom discussions by just looking back and learning from the history. It's interesting, though, that when you're looking at this and you can see how technologies have always altered the way we work and the way we lead. And researchers that never agree on anything, now more or less agree that fourth industrial revolution is a fact, it's here. Still, when we're looking at our research data, last full round of interviews, which we collected just before Corona started, the biggest problem there was managerial mindset. And in many interviews, they seem to be locked in the second industrial revolution, efficiency thinking, control thinking. So we also need to remember that even though we're looking at unprecedentedly fast technologies that make possible things that we never even imagined, and we haven't even seen the beginning of it yet, we're still looking at human psychology, human biology, that's largely unchanged. And like Bill said, we don't like change. Change is difficult for us. And the human brain mindset adjustment, that takes time. So this is one of the things that's really going to challenge us. We really need to think about the fact that we need to think about our thinking, we need to think about work, and we need to think about how we lead it. But more than that, we really need to understand that focusing on one level alone is never going to drive sustainable, socially sustainable, resilient working life. And this is something that there is a fairly unanimous global research agreement. Good colleagues in MIT, for instance, drive the same agenda. And this is basically the idea that for us to, what we're talking about often when we talk about the future of work, we talk about the possibility of all work disappearing and we all landing in some kind of doom, or all work disappearing and we all landing in some kind of happy land when we only do things that we find fulfilling. The fact is, and researchers are really firm about this, that the future of work will be just as good as bad as what we make it. And the responsibility is shared. It's not just the leader's responsibility. It's not just the organization's responsibility. It's not just the employee's responsibility. It's not just the state's responsibility. This future of work will be socially sustainable and resilient for all of us if we use this time that the technological development amply allows us to adapt as well as we can. And that adaptation means different things on different levels. On an individual level, we all should be thinking about, okay, new technologies, what can the machine already do better than I can? What should I be focusing on? What does lifelong learning mean in my life? It doesn't mean only going to a class or taking a university degree. We should be thinking about learning much more widely. We should be thinking about, what can I learn from Markus today? He's doing things like that. He's talking like that. Every single meeting, every single event is a chance to learn something new if you start thinking about the world as a place where you can learn. Furthermore, we should be focusing, as you've heard today from the excellent speeches before me, be focusing on self-management and paying attention to our resilience, understanding what the red flags are, and really trying to be better at this. And at the same time, remember that managing yourself is something that comes easily to some people and is very, very hard. Some might say the hardest skill in the whole world to do for others. Organizational level, we should really be thinking about how are we going to balance out the changing power relations, the growing inequalities that are seeping into organizations too, in the form of different kinds of employment contracts. Facilitating a resilient change process and learning, how do we do that? How do we make sure that there are facilitating, serving leaders around who want that and encourage that and create the psychological safety to be that? And how do we sort of generally create the more socially sustainable working life in organizations? And societal level, you really need to start thinking about our social institutions around work. In most parts of the world, they're lagging behind. They're supporting the type of working structures that are no longer there. And in our interviews, a lot of the leaders bring this up and say that in the past, at least you knew that you could in the end then rely on the legislation on work or something like that. But nowadays, it seems that it's often lagging behind and it actually doesn't have the responses or the answers that you're looking for. So this kind of like understanding how much the context and working on all three different levels, it comes visible through Corona again. It's a great lens for sort of observing this changing nature of work, even though does have it, as I said, the negative sides too. But when we are alone, for instance, think about the growing inequalities, we think about the vaccination situation, and we think about the fact that here in the Nordics, we were looking at the situation where more and more people are doubly vaccinated. Same time, we're looking at the situation where about 1% of Africa is vaccinated. I'm talking about the whole African continent. Now, this alone should give you an idea of that the pandemic is not going to go away if we're only looking after ourselves. And much in the same way, the future of work is not going to be socially sustainable. It's not going to be resilient if we're only focusing on ourselves or the immediate circle around us. We really need to start seeing that we're bearing wider responsibilities if we want to build a more sustainable, socially sustainable future of work. And one way of doing that, I'm talking to an audience of leaders, seasoned leaders, excellent leaders, no doubt, is to understand that researchers are also completely unanimous in that leaders have a gatekeeping role in the quality of future work. The work needs to be done on public sector, private sector, education, as I said, individual, organizational, societal. But your decisions as leaders, and hopefully they are what Juha was advocating for, long-term decisions, long-term thinking, rather than short-term gains, they are absolutely crucial. And one way of doing that, one way of thinking about that is adding into this kind of like thinking about your thinking about your leading, thinking about your work from the perspective of what's changing, what's not changing, what should I do about it. Rethinking your leading and working, and Corona is an excellent tool. And now here I'm offering you an excerpt from my research interview from the beginning of the summer. This person interviewed is a top leader in a multinational company, talking about, I actually did not ask a single question about working culture, but in the interview, they started talking about how Corona has basically they have started leading through networks. First, because they took care of the Corona restrictions, not as a Corona team, but as a network of over 300 people across the company. But then now it has spread to other joint matters. So they have, like he said, that they're embracing this leading through networks. He said that Corona has, well, he said that it's difficult to say whether it was Corona or something else would have come anyway, but Corona has definitely accentuated the need to look at people, and the whole leadership team, the whole management team has been receiving training now for a long time on inclusion, on empathy, on communications, and they're really driving this culture across. An example of this, they told me that when they were trying to normalize and de-stress the situation of working from home by, for instance, leading by example. So the top management would always comment if someone's dog or husband or wife in their underwear would appear in the background, like, oh, hi, there's Marjorie, nice to meet you again. And he was himself saying that it actually has been something that makes him feel like he knows his team better. He knows more about their life. He remembers their names better. He can see it. Rather than thinking about it as a distraction from work, he turned it into something that binds them tighter together. And these are now reflecting on what Gitte was saying, ways of doing things differently, building different kind of working culture, different kind of working environment, and kind of letting people see that it's okay to have your life there, rather than trying to sort of artificially compartmentalize between life and work when it really is impossible, because work is happening in the same space with the whole family. And this is a quote from the interview. We have received a lot more positive things from Corona that we ever can even yet understand. How to be with other people, what's really important, how to take care of people, and social sustainability. And this is like, if you like, a silver lining in this otherwise difficult situation. It is a great learning opportunity to look at the pluses and minuses during Corona time, and then trying to work onwards from there and not think of the minuses as something to feel bad about, but rather your to-do list. So we know from research that socially sustainable working life really demands more thinking about thinking. Thinking about what do we do, how do we do it, who's going to do it, is everyone going to be able to join and feel included, what are the facts and narratives around work, how can we change them? And therefore, my final tool for you today, and something that I think we should all be using in our everyday work, I am using it, is to examine your stories. Because another thing to understand about work is that work is a huge institution. It defines your identity and it connects you to the society, meaning that it cuts across all of your life, all of the aspects. And that means, in other words, that it's very hard to change. And this is part of the resistance. This is part of why there are so many stories that live on related to work that actually are really outdated. Corona, again, has worked as a catalyst here. I've heard countless stories when I've been training people during Corona, and they always start, we always thought that this and this work can never be done virtually. We always thought that this and this can never be done like this. Now we've been able to see that that's actually not true at all. It's BS. We can do it perfectly. People have talked about the last example from last week. I was training people who do sales. They said that it was a fact that never try to sell anything virtually. Now they said that they've actually figured out that in many ways it's actually more efficient, although they still said that there are certain aspects that they're missing. So what I'm encouraging you all to do is look at your own work, look at your teamwork, look at your organization, use Corona, and ask yourself, what are the facts about work here? What are the stories about work here? Are they what they should be? Should we make up a new story? Because based on those facts and stories, then you then react. And that will have an impact on others. If I give you a simple example, working virtually is ripe with stories because we cannot read each other's body language. We're only looking at your faces. So many times I've looked at the faces of participants on the screen and thought, oh my God, that person looks so bored. I wonder if they're bored. And then realized that there I am again, building a narrative, building a story of something that I have no idea what really is. I have no facts whether that person is bored. I have no feedback yet. I only have their face. So this is a great tool for virtual working. This is a great tool for unpacking work and creating a better, more sustainable future of work, in trying to suss out what are the facts, what are the outdated stories that should be changed into facts or new stories, and also considering what are, for instance, the reactions and impacts on others of the outdated stories. Remember to question everything. In order to, and I hate the think outside the box, I like the think about the box. Think about the box that we've put work in. Time and space are modes that we've created. Work is something we've created, so we can rethink it, but it takes a little bit more than just bringing in new technologies and thinking that that's going to do the trick. It takes a lot of great leadership, and that's something that I know that this audience is very good at. So I think that today you've been equipped with several great to-do lists, and I hope that you all take advantage of that. You don't need to do it alone. We here at Future Work aim to serve. We have our website there. We've also built online learning course that anyone can register in. So feel free to examine those and feel free to be in contact with me if there's anything you want to find in terms of research on future work, many different angles of it. Thank you. And I believe there are a few minutes of Markus can come here and tell me how he's doing, or maybe ask me a question if the audience has had a question for me. Thanks very much. It was really, really nice to talk to you.
Thank you very much, Hertta. Very, very valuable and interesting words. And as previously, we've been accumulating questions from our audience, so I'll just be putting forth.
You're not going to tell me how you're doing.
I'm doing fine. I'm doing fine.
Okay,
thank you.
Fine.
Yeah, I hope you are also.
I am.
So it can be argued that inclusion of people is sometimes forgotten when companies and teams push for diversity.
Yes.
It could happen perhaps, and I think I've seen that unfortunately several times happening. And we bring diverse workers in, but how should we be able to include them? Maybe there are some obvious answers, but maybe all of them aren't so obvious ones.
I think it's something that you really need to train. The same leader that I was interviewing was actually bringing up inclusion, and one of the things he stressed was that we also need to remember that when we talk about inclusion, those who are included can never see exclusion unless they're really trained at that. They tend to think that everybody has the same opportunity. I don't know what you're on about. When you have power, you rarely see lack of power unless you're really looking for it. So what he was saying and stressing a lot was that they have spent a lot of time in training the leadership, training the whole management team into looking at things from different perspectives. Because for you to be able to, for instance, a very sort of, if you like, innocent way people can be excluded in organizations, if we don't even bring race or gender, is technical capabilities. If you're very capable with all the latest technologies, if you're very at ease talking about artificial intelligence and robots, it doesn't scare you at all, and you take it more or less for granted that it should be fairly clear for everyone else. More so if we're talking about smartphones or tablets. But then, number one rule when it comes to leading future work, according to my latest interview, and me too, and other research, is don't assume. And I guess that's a good rule also thinking about inclusion. Don't assume, always ask, find out, and kind of try to take a different perspective. For instance, rather than this we see a lot in our data, that a company X had assumed that if they give out the tablet to everyone in the middle management, then efficiency will go up because they'll be able to do things from anywhere without thinking that there are a lot of people there who couldn't use tablets and couldn't bring it up. Because it's very not many of us who wants to say in a team meeting that, by the way, I really can't use a smartphone or a tablet, or I don't understand what you're talking about. That takes a lot of guts, and it takes a certain kind of culture.
Yeah. Sometimes it might be visible for many people who are themselves among the kind of majority of people with respect to this dimension or that dimension, that somebody may be in the risk of being excluded. One could see, for example, sometimes that a group is speaking on one language and there's a person who doesn't know that language, and the person isn't quite there in the circle of speakers, but one might sense that they are perhaps willing to come there. I would kind of change the language to something that everybody understands at that point already.
And
but
actually,
many don't.
And I think that's another great example. And they make a number of it. They said, hey, we can't be excluding people here. You come here, we'll speak English, or you come here, we'll speak Finnish, or you come here, we'll speak Swedish, or whatever. So it's like that's building a certain kind of culture that makes it okay to not understand everything or not speak every language. It depends what you want. If you want a culture of inclusion, you need to make it clear to everyone that that's what you work for, and incentivize something like that.
And of course, for all the leaders to walk the talk.
You need to show example. You need to be the person who says that, hey, oh my God, I completely didn't pay attention to you, or whatever. Or say what they say to us in research interviews. I don't know how to use my smartphone, but thank God I have teenagers at home. So say that to your team. They'll be relieved that they don't need to know everything, and therefore it's okay to be curious and learn all the time.
very important topic to also be discussing and raising in team events. Irrespective of there's somebody in the team who might have been excluded purposely or not, hopefully not on purpose, but anyhow, I think all of the teams in companies which have diversity should be talking about events, situations like this.
Yes.
Now that we were talking some various different kinds of things that relate to IT, there's a question about data. What is the role of data in driving decision making in the future of work? A huge question, but from the viewpoint of what you have been presenting here, he or she asks, for example, from the viewpoints of productivity, customer satisfaction, and worker well-being.
Well, I think that data will have an even greater role. I personally think that I always make a face when we start talking about data as something that's just good, because I think that one thing we need to really keep in mind, whatever we use the data for, is that you and I, everybody who's a researcher knows that you can make data look this or that. You can make stats show that or that. It really depends on what you decide to stress. And I'm not saying that you falsify the results. I'm saying that you stress these numbers over these numbers and you make value judgments. We know that we thought that it was a scientific fact that the Earth was flat not so long ago. Now we agree that it's not. Well, not everyone does, but most of us, I guess. So I think that when it comes to data, whatever you decide to do with it, bear in mind that there is no such thing as objective facts, and that you make a lot of power decisions with your data usage. Then I guess they can be a bit less sensitive when it comes to your customer data, for instance, who you push products for. But when you're, for instance, moving over to the people management side, and start using employee data for evaluating your employees, we're already on the ethically interesting turf. And we can start asking questions of where does the boundary between work and life go? And then this is something that leaders take up in interviews. They say that, well, if we, for instance, have a lot of health data on an employee, and we have health data that indicates that they are on a risk of having a heart attack, is it our people department's issue to tell those people that this person that they are at this risk, or is this something that we need to let them figure it out? Like, you see what I mean? So this data is not something that's just going to make everything neutral and better in all areas, but something that should be taken, like all new technologies, with a lot of critical thinking. And that's something that I think we're lacking.
One more question. I'll just frame that by saying that there's this theory. I don't know so much about it, but I think it might have been called the rich media theory, which is roughly that people understand another person better if they can sense the other person in several different ways, not just to hear the contents of the speech, but also the tones and the way they speak. There's a question maybe related to this that might be the last question here. How is it that phone calls have much been replaced by online meetings? Do we really get benefit out of that?
Now, I think it would be impossible to answer for everyone, because we know that we all have our preferences. And I know actually from my colleagues' COVID data that in there, the preference was that the boss, the leader, would call you one-on-one on phone and say, how are you doing? Rather than having any cafes or virtual meetings as such. I think it depends a lot on the quality of your relationship as well. Sometimes when you're meeting, so I don't think there's, again, a lot of the things I think in future work talk that disturb me is that there is a tendency to come up with universalities, that it's always this and it's always that. And I don't think they hold. And in this case too, I think, yes, probably in certain type of team, if you're used to that media, you like it, and that's what you prefer, it probably you do benefit from that because that's your culture. But then on another case, when you really want to just hear the other person's voice or something you're used to that, maybe it's that. So I think here we come to the contextual situational leader talk, where you really need to know your people, you need to know what fits them, what fits your culture. And then you make your decisions based on that, rather than some research fact that's based on some other team. where this was beneficial. So I think that you cannot overstress the need to do the analysis in your own organization in terms of what does the change look like in our organization, in our team, in my work, what does the culture look like, who does what, and then going from there with your technologies, with your decisions, with your whatever you do.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you, Hertta, very much. Very nice to be hearing your presentation and your views and your reflections also on these questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.